In tonight's lecture, we're going to be talking about sculpture. And there's a couple different ways that sculpture can be created. We have the subtractive process on one side and the additive process on the other. We're going to talk about the subtractive process first. And in the subtractive process, there's only one subcategory, and that was carving. So just as the name sounds, with the subtractive process, we're taking a block of material. A lot of times we're going to use wood, we're going to use some type of stone material, maybe limestone, or we're going to be taking marble. And we're going to start chipping, gouging, hammering away at it until the desired form is achieved. Now, humans have been using the subtractive process of carving for thousands and thousands of years. We see early carved sculptures dating back to prehistoric time. At the left, we have the woman of Brassempouy, who is only about 1.25 inches in height. But you can see some really detailed work around her face, and look at the way her hair is divided up, almost abstracted in a way. Over at the right, we have Lion Human, and this is one of my favorite sculptures because it dates back so far away, around 30,000 BC. And it's also very unique for a couple of different reasons. Number one, that this is gigantic compared to other prehistoric sculptures. As I mentioned, the woman of Brassempouy is just over 1 inch tall. Well, Lion Human is just about 1 foot tall. And we're also looking at a figure that is half human and half animal. When you think back to the roles of the artist lecture, artists have to have the power of imagination, and this definitely fulfills that third role of the artist. Another reason why I think it's really cool is this was found at the beginning of World War II in a cave in Germany, and the archaeologists could not go into the cave to pull this figure out because the war had begun. And so they knew it was there. They were going to get it as soon as the war was over. And so it's officially recovered in 1945, just at the end of World War II. We see carving done during the Egyptian time period, during the Greek civilization. And particularly, I want to point out this sculpture at the right is called Hermes and Dionysos. Hermes is the man, Dionysos is the child, and this is also the god of wine. So we believe that Hermes was possibly holding up a cluster of grapes that Dionysos was reaching for. But what's unique about this sculpture, and I'm going to go back for just a moment for us to take a look at the Egyptian sculpture. And we can see how solid and geometric these figures are. Even the figure at the left, which is called Pepi II and his mother. So Pepi II is the child. He's the pharaoh of Egypt. This figure is made out of alabaster, so it's fairly easy to carve. So we do have some negative space around the arms and between the figures and such. But it's very angular, very geometric. The figure at the right is made out of diorite. This is almost an incredibly difficult sculpture to carve. That's why the area between the bodies, the legs, the arms are still filled in and solid. And that's also one of the reasons that this sculpture, being 4,500 years old, looks pretty much brand new. But we have this idea, this possible illusion of motion, because he's got 1 foot set in front of the other. But that's really all we have. We don't believe that this sculpture is nowhere nearly as real as these classical Greek sculptures are. I mean, this almost looks as if the body has been transformed into marble. These look as if they could start to move right off of the pedestal. And particularly with Hermes and Dionysos, I wanted to call your attention to one of the terms on the study guide, which is contrapposto. Hermes and Dionysos is what's called in the contrapposto stance, meaning that we have the hips and legs in a different position than the shoulders and the head. And I know that's kind of a really horrible definition. And I'm going to try to explain it a little bit more. But you can kind of see how the left side, when we look at this sculpture, our left side, that hip, is higher than his hip on our right side. And counter that with the shoulder is kind of on the lower side at the left and higher up at the right, where Dionysos has his hands on top of his shoulder. That idea of that natural weight shift makes the sculpture much more dynamic and lifelike. The Greek classical age is where we first start to see this. We see it throughout the Hellenistic age, and then we also see it in the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, though, when the Roman Empire falls, we start to have sculpture going back to how it looked in ancient Egypt. Very solid, very unmoving, very frontal. So here's one of our ancient art jokes. Forgive us, we don't have a lot of jokes. All right. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, and we kind of revert back a little bit to ancient ways of creating art, these techniques that come around during the classical age are brought back after the gulf of the Dark Ages. So the fall of the Roman Empire, let's call that around 500 AD. We start to see in the Renaissance, particularly in the 1400s, artists such as Donatello. In the 1500s, artists such as Michelangelo, whose work is at the left, and we got Bernini from the 1600s at the right. They start to bring back those classical ideas of contrapposto to make the sculptures much more lifelike. And we're talking about carving. We still have carving during the contemporary age. And now we're going to move on to the additive process. And this is the exact opposite of the subtractive process, right? Instead of removing material, now we're going to be adding material. And there's going to be 3 subcategories we're dealing with: modeling, casting, and assemblage. We're going to take modeling first. This is where we take a pliable material such as clay, form it into the object, and then particularly with clay, we then put it into a kiln. And when it comes out of a kiln, it's no longer clay, now it's considered ceramics. We're going to talk about ceramics in a separate lecture called Craft versus Fine Art later in the semester. Robert Arneson is one of the more famous contemporary sculptors that deals with modeling. And he's got a great handmade quality to his works, but he'll, like in this case, slide a machine-made bottle into this tray. And I always thought this work that he did was pretty cool. And so for modeling, now we're going to go into casting. And casting is where we take molten metal and pour it into molds. The lost wax casting method is about creating a hollow sculpture. So casting first came around 2500 BC, which is the beginning of the Bronze Age. So we move from the Stone Age, which is kind of the prehistoric time period, into the Bronze Age. When we start to use metal, metal is very expensive, especially when we compare it to other artistic mediums such as marble. It is 10 times more expensive to create a sculpture of the same size out of bronze than it is marble. And so we definitely want to make sure that it's hollow, because you can imagine how much material, how much weight, and how much expense it would be if this were a solid figure. This is what's called a head of an oba. And an oba is a ruler of a dynasty in Nigeria. And this is where we actually start to see the beginnings of the lost wax casting method. The method itself is about 9 different steps, so it's even more dynamic than this diagram is. But the main thing you need to know, and this is true lost wax casting in Nigeria, this is something that you just need to know that it's going to give us a hollow sculpture. Kind of like, since it's Easter time right now when I'm making this video, that the chocolate Easter bunnies we'd get as a kid, and then we'd think, oh man, look at all that chocolate, and we bite into it and we find out that the chocolate is pretty thin and it's a hollow sculpture. You can imagine how expensive that chocolate rabbit would have been if it was solid chocolate. So this is a sculpture that's made with the lost wax casting method. It is called The Burghers of Calais by Rodin. And Rodin is one of those sculptors that we don't really hear a whole lot from. Normally we hear about people like Donatello and Michelangelo, and even during the Baroque age we hear about Bernini. However, Rodin is a modernist artist, and he was active in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The scene he depicts is from the 100 Years' War between England and France, and it dates back to about 1350. So the English have sieged the French port city of Calais, and in order to free their city, these 5 leaders agree to sacrifice themselves. And so what you have here are these 5 individuals marching off to what they believe is going to be their death. They're dressed up in burlap bags for clothes, and there are already nooses of rope tied around their necks. The interesting thing about this work, and the whole idea as well, is to see the expression in their faces, from anger to resentment to sorrow. And that's really what makes this sculptural set special. It's also a work that depicts a moment of military loss instead of victory. So it's totally an antithesis of normal sculptures that we see. The good news is that these individuals are not going to be put to death. The wife of the King of England asks her husband to spare their lives, which he does. Another thing that's unique about this work is that it does not sit up on a very high pedestal, just kind of high enough to keep it away from water and such. But the idea is that we need to look into their faces to see their expressions. And so as we move around this work, it's almost as if we're walking with them to their demise. And you'll see this several places. There's a group in front of the Norton Simon Museum here in Pasadena. Other works that are made from casting is this one. This is Tilted Arc by Richard Serra. It's one of the more infamous artworks. It's an artwork that was a public commission set in a public location, and it was disliked so much it was torn down. One of the very few works I know that have ever had that happen to it. Richard Serra is a very famous artist, and I agree that this was a pretty poor work overall, and especially where it was located. But he makes some absolutely beautiful art, and instead of making this himself, which he does a lot of his own works, and he at least helps on them, is he hires crews of construction workers that are usually building hulls of ships. I mean, these are that massive amounts of metal. This work here in the lower part of the Broad wing of the LA County Museum of Art. And this one I thought was really beautiful. It's out in the landscape in New Zealand, and it just totally moves with the contours of the land, almost as if it's a snake moving through the environment. And now we're going to talk about assemblage art, and this is my favorite type of art because we're taking non-art elements, basically trash, and making art out of it. This is something we see a lot of post-1945 when we enter the contemporary era. But this work here dates back to the 1920s, and it's created by Salvador Dali. So we really start to see the beginning of assemblage art way back in Surrealism. And I just think these works are so inventive and so kind of really neat to look at. Among the most famous assemblage artists is Edward KEINHOLZ. He's originally from Texas, moved to Southern California in his 20s, and created some wonderful works. You can still visit his house up on Nash Drive in North Hollywood. So you can definitely see what assemblage sculpture looks like. It's basically, as I said, it's trash, but there's a certain really cool poetic quality that is involved here. He does have some kids, and he would tell them that they needed to pick up their toys every night or else they'd find it in sculptures that he would make. This is one of his more famous and also more controversial works that we see at the LA County Museum of Art. The illegal operation shows a backroom abortion clinic, and this is a stock photo of this work. This is one that I took when I worked at the LA County Museum, and there's a certain quality to this work when you see it in person. It has a certain aura about it. The light is very harsh, and we also have this term in contemporary art called recontextualization, where we take that shopping cart, but here it's an operating chair or table, where we have this bag of cement that is split. It takes the form of a female body. And when you see this work in person, you'll notice that the bedpan underneath, the tools and such, are all dirty, they're old, they're rusted, and so it definitely has its own kind of dark feel to it. Other assemblage artists would be like Robert Gober, and he's a much more contemporary artist. I have seen one of these in person as well, and I can tell you it is definitely a showstopper. I was walking through an exhibit, and it just makes you stop when you see these legs coming out of a wall. And it's almost as if your first inclination is that someone's fallen, and your first inclination is to go and help them. But it's just a very odd work. And like a lot of contemporary art, the works are untitled, with the idea that you are going to make up your own story, your own narrative about these works, rather than being influenced by the artist's title of the work. So now let's take a look at how sculpture is experienced. And we have three different ways: in relief, in the round, and as an environment. Relief sculpture is broken down into three particular sections. We have low relief, which sometimes you'll hear the term bas relief. This is where the figure is very much connected to the background. We'll see this on coins, we'll see this on medals, and we'll also definitely see it in art. The figures here very much attached to the background. They do not protrude far at all. So my usual rule is that if the figure is 50% or less emerging from the wall, it's going to be low relief or bas relief. High relief is where the figure is much more three-dimensional, and in certain cases looks like it's carved separately and set up to a wall. But we can see with this image, looking at it from below, that this is part of the original block of marble. So there's much more of a sculptural quality with high relief. You can imagine it's a lot more difficult to do, and absolutely it is a lot more rare than low relief is. So if a figure looks like this, where it is sculpted almost three-dimensionally, but still attached to the background, this is high relief. In my example, which I have on the study guide here, is a sarcophagus from the Roman age. And we also had the term repoussé as a type of relief sculpture. This is done exclusively with metal, and it's where we have, in this case, gold, and the figures and scene are not carved, but they're hammered out from the back side of the metal. This is called a VAPHEIO cup because it was found in the city of VAPHEIO in mainland Greece, although it was most likely made by an individual from the island of Crete, just because of the quality of the workmanship and also the subject matter that we see around the cup. Sculpture in the round is exactly as that sounds. It's sculpture that can be seen from all sides. It's meant to be seen all the way around. And then we have sculpture as an environment. And here there's two subcategories. There are installations and there's earthworks. So an installation can be either inside or it can be outside. And the idea is that there are multiple pieces here, but they're looked at as one art object. So they're kind of like an ensemble in a way. These works here are by the African-American artist Kara Walker, and she rose to fame right around the year 2000 with these silhouettes. She would have them installed in a very large room, and they would usually be stories of the antebellum South told on the wall through these images. What was really unique about her works is that she would drop in light projection devices in the center of the room. So as you are following along with the story here, your silhouette, your shadow would then be on the wall and would take part in it. This is an installation that is outside, and this is by the artist Chris Burden.
TV?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Right.
So it's pretty cool to see this work being made. Chris Burden is also someone who's famous for creating the lights out in front of the LA County Museum, and we're going to see him in our next lecture on performance art, because before he became this world-class sculptor, he was a performance artist in the 1970s. Other forms of environments are earthworks, earth art, and environmental art, and all these terms are synonymous. Earth artists kind of got their inspiration from ancient land art, which the Great Serpent Mound is among the most famous. Dating back to 600 BC, it is in Ohio, and the face or the head of the snake is off to the upper right, and it's got its mouth open. It looks like it's swallowing an egg, and you can see the body wrapping around to the tail in the lower left-hand side of this image. Probably the most famous is the Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, and we talked about it at length as well during the Roles of the Artist lecture. And I'm going to go ahead and drop in another video here from Smart History that tells you all about this work.
In 1970, Robert Smithson hired several people to help him create Spiral Jetty. We're standing right in the middle, at the edge of the Great Salt Lake in Utah.
But we're not seeing this the way that it existed when Smithson first created it, where it was an intersection between the land and the very odd water of the Great Salt Lake.
This is a terminal basin, a huge lake that had been largely fresh water, but there is no outlet. So the water, once it flows here from rivers and streams, collects and then simply evaporates, which means that the water is dense with minerals.
And especially with salt, very much like the Dead Sea in the Middle East. And this is one of a handful of these terminal basins that exist in the world.
Almost nothing can live here. There are a few fish that live at the outlet of some of the freshwater rivers. And
there are brine shrimp and algae. In fact, there's a particular kind of algae that makes the water turn pinkish red. And that was true when Smithson created Spiral Jetty. But today, as we look out at the lake, it's blue.
With help from the Dawn Gallery, which represented him, Smithson was able to bring a front loader and dump trucks, a tractor, to help move these basalt stones and sand and some soil into place.
By creating a spiral, Smithson created lots of opportunities where the land and the water could meet one another.
But right now, because the American West is in the midst of a drought, the water has receded and is at a great distance from this earthwork.
So instead of the water filling the spaces in between the spiral, we have sand. So this was very much meant to be a work of art that changed based on natural principles.
Smithson was interested in the idea of entropy, the idea of the way things break down, and his intervention in this natural landscape. It's an expression of the way in which artists have thought about the landscape for many years.
We could go back to artists like Caspar David Friedrich, who thought about the overwhelming size and power of nature and the smallness of man. And that's certainly one of the themes here for me as we stand here. But we could also think about the importance of the vastness of the American landscape in 19th century American painting, or even its importance to the abstract expressionists in the 1950s.
We can go even further back and look at the artwork of indigenous peoples in the Americas long before the Europeans arrived. The geoglyphs that are known as the Nazca lines in Peru, in South America, or the earthworks that come out of the Fort Ancient culture in North America. And in fact, the very shape of Spiral Jetty is a form that has shown up in petroglyphs throughout the American West.
And it's a form that appears in nature quite frequently.
One of the anecdotes that Smithson apparently was aware of was the centuries-old idea that the Great Salt Lake contained a whirlpool that somehow connected it to the Pacific Ocean. rotation. So the idea of a spiral or whirlpool is active even in these stories that predate Smithson. But this is also a sculpture that is rooted in the 20th century, in an industrial culture. 1970 was the year of the first Earth Day, and that signaled an important early moment in the environmental movement. The idea of the ruination that man was visiting on nature is clearly informing work like this.
And Earth Day being this time when we reflect on environmental issues, but the relationship between the growing industrial nature of the United States and the amazingly beautiful, vast virgin landscape that was here when Europeans arrived is a theme throughout 19th century American painting. And as we stand here, we see mountains. We see this basalt that's formed from a volcano. So we have a very powerful sense of the passage of time that I think was very interesting to Smithson. By putting art outside in the world, it becomes part of the process of nature. It can't be conserved.
In 1970, this was still a radical idea, the idea of taking art off the wall, bringing it outside of the confines of a home or a museum.
And thereby outside of the commercial of a work that could be bought and sold.
Smithson was interested in creating a porous relationship between that more controlled gallery experience and the experience of art in the world. So can a work like this also exist in Manhattan? Can it also exist in a gallery?
Well, we did drive 2 hours from Salt Lake City, so one does have to make an intentional pilgrimage to see this. We're really in the middle of a vast, empty space in the American West.
And yet this artwork was not conceived of as existing only here.
There's a video, there are aerial photographs, and so like many works of art in the 1960s and 70s that were ephemeral, they exist through their documentation, although this still exists here also.
And I have to say, I wouldn't feel as if I had experienced this work of art fully had I not come out here.
Standing here looking at Spiral Jetty and being really aware of how different it is than when Smithson created it in 1970 really makes me think about museums as places where we entrust works of art. We lock them away from time. We conserve them and create special conditions to stop time from hurting them. But here Smithson created something that time is supposed to change.
Museums, in a sense, try to do the impossible, which raises a really interesting question. What do we do with the significant work of art that was intended to change over time? This work of art and the land that it sits on came under the control of the DIA Art Foundation. What does an institution like DIA do with something like this? Does it try to protect it? Does it allow natural and industrial forces to play with the landscape around it? And so what DIA did is, in concert with the Getty Conservation Institute, is to make the decision to regularly document this object.
You mentioned this idea of entropy, which was so important to Smithson, this idea that the tendency of all things, according to the laws of physics, is to move from order to disorder, to chaos. And I think we have that sense of things coming apart here.
So Smithson is imposing geometric order into this natural landscape, into this vast space that is in the process over millions of years of disassembling. But here, more specifically, we can see the way his intervention is slowly coming apart.
And I think that sense that over millions of years this will come apart makes us aware of the brevity of our own lifespans in the grandeur of time.
As you may remember from our earlier lecture, I told you that Robert Smithson was killed in a plane crash shortly after this work was completed. His widow is named Nancy Holt, and she was an artist in her own right. And we're going to take a look at sun tunnels. This is another earthwork, also in Utah. And again, this is a location where you're not going to normally visit. And so a lot of times we just have photographic or video documentation of earthworks. This is a set of 4 pipes, each of them weighing over 22 tons, and they're arranged in such a way that you'll be able to see the rising and setting sun of the winter and summer solstice. Also on these works, drilled into the sides are various constellations, such as Perseus and Draco. The last work I want to look at is Lightning Field, and this is by the artist Walter de Maria. Instead of Utah, this time we're going to be in New Mexico. And this is a work you can actually go and visit, stay in the cabin here that's off to the left. You do have to make reservations, and it does cost a couple of $100s per night. You arrive into the city, and you're driven out here, dropped off, and they will pick you up when your reservation has ended. There are 400 stainless steel poles out in the desert in a grid-like pattern. It will take you about 2.5 hours to walk around the perimeter of the lightning field, but this is also a very active time during the summer, and this is when most of the people come to the lightning field to stay and to watch this event. And I'm just going to put some visitor information for you up on the screen. So you can see it's not a cheap vacation by any means, but definitely worth the trip. And with this, I'm going to end our lecture on sculpture, and I will see you at our next lecture, which is going to be on performance art.